Ram Ram everyone and welcome back. I had initially planned on making a longer video on Pakistan and the circus that is there at the moment. However, given the spate of encounters we have witnessed and judging by some of the reactions to it, I thought shedding some light on the broad strokes of what's happening in Jammu and Kashmir would be more helpful. I had wanted to do a video on this subject earlier, but I thought it was necessary for tensions to cool a little before a video like this could be uploaded onto the Indian internet. My aim with this video is to soothe some of the friction caused by uncomfortable questions being raised at an emotionally raw time for many Indians, due in part to the losses incurred in some of these encounters. As such, I'll be trying to answer questions that many feel haven't been answered well enough. I'll try and give you a feel of the terrain these operations are taking place in, some of the challenges Indian security forces face, and the nature of the threat itself. I've purposely kept this video as simple as possible to reach people who don't usually follow security news and who, honestly, just tune out when they see the online debates. As such, if I don't cover something you thought was important, I apologize. Feel free to express those opinions in the comments below. Just be respectful is all I ask. You haven't served. I'm going to have to spend a little time on this mode of argumentation because of how often it's been invoked to silence conversations in this space. Insulting someone explicitly or implicitly by calling them keyboard warriors or asking them for their service record simply because you don't like their argument or tone isn't really the slam dunk people think it is. The Russians and Ukrainians have more experience in 21st century conventional war fighting than anyone serving in the Indian Armed Forces today. Should we sack all of our officers and hire them to command our forces? They have more quote-unquote experience after all. Civilians too can contribute to discussions on security. In Ukraine, it's the civilians who are innovating with drones, creating open source intelligence-driven maps used by commanders and analysts in different capacities, teaching soldiers about life-saving first aid, raising money for drones, vehicles, radios, and other kit, plugging capability gaps down at the squad and platoon level, acting as intelligence assets deep behind enemy lines, and doing a bulk of the information warfare. Most importantly, it's these very civilians, either as volunteers or mobilized, who are forming increasingly large parts of the Russian and Ukrainian armies. Plumbers, programmers, and artists, all fighting and dying as soldiers. You don't have to like or dislike either side of the debate to see how civilians, when treated with a little respect, can act as powerful force multipliers. I agree India is not fighting an existential war of survival at the moment, but to treat civilians like unwanted guests at a party is not a healthy sign, especially given how opaque and ego-driven much of Indian security discourse is. This said, it is also important to realize that soldiers are normal human beings at the end of the day. Human beings who form extremely close bonds with one another. They operate in an environment where an accident or mistake can have fatal consequences. They too have wives, children, and parents to think of. They are separated from their families for long stretches of time, often in remote areas. On top of all this, the compensation they receive for their services are lukewarm, given the risks needed to be taken. It pays to remember that a small select group of people who happen to get into Twitter spats regularly do not represent the veteran community as a whole. Yes, it can be vexing to have to engage with such people, but to think that every single veteran is like them is a huge mistake. This is why I ask those who have served and those who follow security closely to agree on one simple statement. Address the argument, not the person. So, without dilly-dallying any longer, let's get into the video. Now, to give you an idea of the kind of terrain the Indian forces are operating in, let's take a look at two different videos. I'll be playing the two videos back to back. The first video is taken from Ukraine, while the second one is from Jammu. As you can tell, terrain plays a big role in how an operation is conducted and the challenges faced. If you're operating in flat, open farmland with some tree lines separating the farms, your approach is going to be different than if you are having to operate on the steep slopes of a forested hill or mountain. On a flatter patch of land, you are able to bring to bear heavier armored vehicles, tanks, and in the absence of too much vegetation, are able to gain a good visual from drones. The moment you shift to hilly terrain, especially one with a lot of vegetation, it starts to become clear why it's much harder to carry out operations. Suddenly, you are a lot more reliant on infantry to accomplish your task. You can use armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, but only in a limited role, if and where the terrain allows. Heavier vehicles like tanks are much harder to use successfully. Drones can be used, but a lot depends on how thick the forest cover is and what kind of drone is being used. This isn't even looking at weather patterns. Heavy rainfall or snowfall can often make undertaking operations next to impossible or severely slow down the operation and even allow trapped enemies an opening to flee. More on this in a bit. Another equally important variable is that of the threat. In simpler words, the enemy. While on a more meta or zoomed out level, this variable may appear less important, it is anything but. Consider this. If you had orders to take a trench and were told that the enemy in those trenches were conscript soldiers who lacked proper training and equipment, had not ventured out of their trenches for days and were low on morale, would that affect how you approach the task? Would you be more confident in taking this trench? Maybe push more aggressively? Maybe be willing to take more risks than normal? Perhaps even choose to send your heavy vehicles and tanks right up to the trench and dismount directly on top of their positions? Now, how about if I told you that the same trench was held by veteran paratroopers who were well equipped, highly trained, seen setting up ATGM positions, that is anti-tank weapons, near the trench and willing to fight to the last man? Are you now more concerned about the attack? Would you be more methodical in how you push? Would you rely more heavily on artillery and other indirect fire assets? Would you be more mindful of ATGM teams waiting to ambush your vehicles? Would you dismount your infantry much earlier to avoid losing them to ambushes? Would you display more patience in assaulting this trench? I think by now, most of you are understanding what I'm trying to say. When the enemy is described as being quote-unquote well-trained and motivated, it typically means that at the minimum, their knowledge of tactics and willingness to fight is at a level that enables them to do more damage than whatever the usual standard enemy is capable of. Notice, however, that in the above examples, the context is that of a conventional war. In an insurgency, the enemy is rarely holding a trench or a dugout. Unless trapped or by design, they are typically unwilling to hold their ground and fight, much preferring to attack and escape, what we'd call hit and run. They also vary from locals who are recruited into these outfits and often receive minimal to no training, all the way up to well-trained and equipped foreign fighters who cross the line of control. Now imagine facing such a threat that can blend in with the local population of an area, or a threat that melts away into the forests that dominate the steep gradients of the Pir Panjal range. Counterinsurgency itself is quite different from conventional war fighting, especially so when done within your own country's borders. There is no fixed objective to take, no defensive line to breach, no pincer attacks involving brigades and divisions, no armored battles. Here, you are using the military to fight in an area where the people are fellow citizens, not foreign residents, where the enemy is aiming to strike fear in the hearts of the population that does not accept the writ and attract recruits by framing the government as an oppressive tyrant. It is an unending slow burn with local intelligence and patrolling forming the backbone of counter-terror operations. The aim is not to take and hold areas, but to weed out the rotten apples, ensure the return of normalcy, and restore the primacy of the state. In India's case, the insurgency is supported by a hostile state, Pakistan, that borders the areas afflicted by this menace. From the little that is known publicly, the enemy Indian armed forces have recently been facing is typically a Pakistani origin fighter who is well trained and equipped, sometimes with experience fighting in Afghanistan. They are ferried across into India and receive support from a niche network within Jammu and Kashmir. They prefer to fight in terrain that is either semi-forested or forested, typically in order to maximize avenues of escape and casualties inflicted. Unlike the counterparts that operate in the valley, they prefer to cross back across the line of control into Pakistan once they have broken off contact with the Indian security forces. They tend to choose their ambush spots carefully, generally doing a recce or reconnaissance to plan out their positions and escape routes. They record their attacks and its aftermath, passing this material back across the fence to their handlers in Pakistan. Their targets tend to be the indigenous Hindu minority of Kashmir and armed forces personnel. The purpose of their attacks is to simultaneously strike fear into the hearts of the minorities, forcing them to flee, while also challenging the writ of the state by going after service personnel. All of this under the broad umbrella of kickstarting terrorism to disrupt peace in the region. What is unusual about this new threat is that their psychological operations are much more refined relative to what has been seen in the region to date. People I have spoken to strongly hold that such sophistication in terms of information operations is the result of the people responsible for the PSYOPs being a part or on the payroll of Pakistani intelligence. I will not name the groups and I request you to not do so as well. This is because they are little more than a rebranded version of two other groups, terrorist groups known to most Indian viewers of this video, the Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. Allow me to quote from an India Today report when it comes to one of the groups. Quote, "What makes TRF, the rebranded LET, the most active and dangerous? In its annual report for 2022, the Jammu and Kashmir police said 172 terrorists, including 42 foreign nationals, were killed in over 90 operations by security forces in Kashmir in 2022. Of the terrorists killed in the valley, most, 108, belonged to the Resistance Front or Lashkar-e-Taiba. Also, of the 100 men who joined terrorist groups, 74 were recruited by TRF, which shows the growing threat from the Pakistan-backed terrorist group." End quote. Now that we have some general background to work on, let's take a broad strokes view of how this new enemy operates, tying their tactics to terrain a little later. As I referenced earlier, they are careful and particular about the places they choose for an ambush. Using their niche support networks, they track the movement of convoys and look for targets of opportunity. These are typically vehicles or people they can ambush using the armament they have on hand, usually an AK variant of some kind, pistols as well as grenades. They also practice luring and trapping. This seems to have been the case in some encounters, either through people pretending to be informants or through information designed to feed them into a trap. Indian security forces are led into an ambush. It's easy to say that security personnel should show better judgment, but these things are not black and white in such situations. If an informant who has previously supplied good information comes up to you informing you of his latest find, are you more or less willing to trust him? You doubt his words, but knowing his track record, not doing anything and being proven wrong means that you're letting terrorists continue plotting or escaping. Sometimes you may be gently encouraged to verify the information. Nothing official, of course, just a suggestion from the higher-ups. What then? For all the talk of better judgment and cultivation of sources, luck and circumstance may play much more of a role than many, including service personnel themselves, may like. What makes this new threat particularly dangerous is that in the process of selecting an ambush spot, they are careful to analyze which ones allow them the ability to break contact and melt back into the jungles. This is important as it allows, quite often, battle-tested combatants to escape. This in turn means these groups accrue a pool of veteran fighters. More experience typically means valuable information passed on to the next batch of recruits and attacks that are more damaging in nature. As mentioned before, in the aftermath of the ambush, the terrorists will usually film and photograph their attack before moving on to the next stage, splitting. Splitting refers to the group that conducted the ambush separating into smaller groups and moving in different directions along pre-planned escape routes using local help through their niche support networks. This makes the job of tracking and eliminating them that much harder. Moreover, eliminating one of these smaller teams doesn't mean the eradication of the group as a whole, only a part of it, leaving the others with a chance at escaping. Once out of any danger, the photographs and videos are used by these organizations for the purposes of information warfare, taunting the Indian security apparatus and attempting to change the narrative to oppressed versus oppressor rather than the truth of terrorist versus innocents. It also plays into their attempts to bolster recruitment to woo more locals into their ranks. Coming back to the point of terrain I had brought up earlier, it is important to understand that the Pir Panjal region in which much of these attacks and fighting is taking place is extremely tough ground to be carrying out counterinsurgency activity in. You've got steep inclines, dense woods, cave systems and rock formations that can easily hide groups. In the case of small towns that exist in valleys, civilian areas are also used to limit how hard the Indian security personnel can punch. A person I respect immensely and who is familiar with operating in the area told me how, quote, buggers will hide in boulders and you'll pass over them, end quote. Just stop and try to visualize that for a moment. You're operating in terrain so challenging, you can literally walk over the enemy or be a few meters away from him and never notice. Additionally, it becomes extremely treacherous to close in for a decisive blow due to the threat of booby traps and ambush. This is the part that claims the most lives outside of the attack itself. They can plant IEDs, that is explosive devices, along avenues they know forces will be using, create formidable shooting positions to fire upon unsuspecting Jawans, and use the incline of the slopes to turn any advance on their positions into a nightmare. If this sounds terrifying, imagine doing it when it's pelting down rain and the whole area turns muddy, mucky and slippery. Due to how jagged the terrain is, it also makes containing the enemy quite difficult. It's relatively easier to cordon off a town so as to restrict movement once you trap your target. It's much harder to do the same across steep, densely wooded hills where you can barely spot people move, doubly so when it's pouring down rain. The opportunities for escape such a landscape offer is incomparable. Any attempt to corner, trap and neutralize threats in such an environment takes time, resources and a methodical approach. This brings us to perhaps the most talked about part of this issue, that of using heavier weaponry to take down these threats and preserve human life. Before going any further, it is important to understand that because the security forces are conducting their campaign against terrorists within the territory of India, they operate under certain conditions set by the politicians of this country. For reasons that you can argue for or against, there is a very clear hesitation among the political elite of the country to use close air support or other heavier weapons when it comes to operations. Broadly speaking, the justification seems to be that using such means within a state or union territory of India and possibly on some of its people is morally unacceptable. I am sure you have strong opinions on this matter, but please remember to be civil about it in the comments. That said, there is also another component to this, that of proximity and once again terrain. While it may make sense to use helicopters or say artillery when the position of the enemy is known, can be tracked and an element on the ground available to correct fire, it is a lot harder to do so if that element has been caught in an ambush and are locked in a vicious firefight for their lives. For one, it's a lot harder to concentrate on correcting fire when bullets are whizzing by you like angry bees, And more importantly, you don't want the heavier ordnance being used to accidentally take you out as well as your men. Something that is very easy to do if you and your enemy are close to each other. A lot of Vietnam veterans, particularly those who served in the legendary MACV-SOG units, talk about how when they would call in air support, their Vietnamese opponents would begin rapidly closing the distance with them, sometimes straight up sprinting towards them, knowing that the safest place to be when the napalm dropped was as close as possible to the Americans. Not every encounter is the same. In some cases, the conditions to deploy munitions as heavy as 2,000-pound bombs may be perfect, while in others, even using a simple general-purpose machine gun from a helicopter to strafe the ground may be dangerous. This brings us to drones. Those among you who have paid attention to the conflict in Ukraine and more recently in Israel have likely noticed the proliferation of drones. These drones could range anywhere from expensive and purpose-built for the military to FPV kamikaze drones to simple DJI Mavics you can buy off the internet. The DJI quadcopters in particular can be repurposed to carry droppable munitions to take out installations, armor or people. They will fly right on top of the target before releasing their explosive payload, often to fatal consequences. This form of drone warfare does not involve the much larger HALE or MALE, hail or mail drones. As such, they offer a workaround to the above mentioned restriction placed upon security forces. After all, in a non-urban area, these drones are typically dropping munitions that are no larger than a 750 milliliter Pepsi bottle directly on top of the enemy. When used by a trained operator, the risk of friendly fire is less than some of the other methods discussed. The drone dropped munitions can pack a punch. The drone can carry multiple units of the munition, typically 2 per drone, and upon dropping the munition can continue acting in a reconnaissance capacity. This is precisely why I speculate that you saw drones being used in the Gadol encounter. Once the enemies had been located and the location of their hideout discovered, security personnel used drones in order to destroy the cover and attempt to neutralize the enemy. Even if these drones don't directly neutralize the enemy, the damage they can cause to cover and the injuries they can inflict make them a valuable asset. Zooming out a little, it is important to understand that the army is also learning from its experiences, sometimes tragic experiences in Kashmir. It is experimenting with newer tactics and processes, especially those designed to ensure the safety of its troops in these dangerous encounters. You can never completely erase the possibility of loss of life in such operations, however. If the intel is cooked and you're unlucky, well, you get the idea. These attacks are coming at a time when relative normalcy and peace has returned to the territory after the nullification of Article 370. Important infrastructure projects like USBRL, hosting events like G20, the arrival of malls and theatres, minorities able to celebrate their festivals, as well as a renewed push to bring jobs and good governance into the once terror-riven region has come alongside a drastic decline in violence, particularly those perpetrated by terror groups. The economy of the region doing well, an end to the tyranny of distance thanks to USBRL, and people increasingly turning to the government authorities to have their problems resolved means the sources of funding and recruitment for terror organizations within the region are drying up. This in turn means the gradual move of the region towards becoming just another part of India rather than a territory seen to be special, which is to say separate from India. The overall aim of this new threat, therefore, appears to be the destabilization of this process and the region. In fact, I have learned from people I have talked to that there has been a noticeable decline in the overground worker phenomenon. People who don't directly carry out terror attacks but help the organizations facilitate them via logistical support, cash, shelter, and other infrastructure. The crackdown by the government has meant that niche or specialized networks discussed earlier in the video have sprung up to support these rebranded terror groups. As such, it is harder to detect and dismantle these networks. Nevertheless, work on dismantling these networks continues. There are also reports emerging that countries like Nepal are becoming an entry point for these elements. Because the line of control is now so heavily monitored, patrolled and protected, softer borders like the Indo-Nepali ones are being exploited for ingress into the country. Changing times, changing tactics and changing responses seem to be the theme in the security architecture of the region. Hopefully, this video has provided some context to what is transpiring in Jammu and Kashmir, as well as the challenges and threats the security personnel stationed there face. Once again, I will appeal to you to be polite in the comment section. It's easy to be blunt about the topic, but showing a bit of empathy can go a long way in having a more productive conversation. Until we meet again for a new video, please hit the like and subscribe button. See you later, alligators.